All right, so continuing the theme of God's blessing upon the life of Abraham, this call to follow him to a new land, a land that was not one familiar to the family, but a new land in which God would bring a new form of creation, a recreation of humanity, a humanity following him by faith. And again, how Abram becomes an exemplar of faith is that he follows God, and God would, of course, reckon it to him as righteousness, as Genesis tells us and as Paul reiterates in the book of Romans. Back to looking at Waltke's commentary, God's gracious plan. Broad new strokes, he describes on page 202, to bless the earth, comes suddenly and brilliantly upon the canvas of sacred history. The Lord has not spoken to his saints since his covenant with Noah, in which he resolved to bless the earth and never again treat it with contempt. Now suddenly his creative word to bless the tribes and nations, which he has scattered. Again, Genesis 10, the table of nations and the background of the Tower of Babel. He has scattered the nations. Languages have emerged. This word of benediction counterbalances his words of malediction against the tower builders. Reciprocally, Abraham, with astounding suddenness, as he describes very illustriously, charges out in obedience and faith. The description of Abram's pilgrimage is structured according to a very selective itinerary, going from Haran to Canaan, featuring Abraham's obedience, his journey from the land and through the land from north to south, featuring important cities like Shechem, eventually moving to the Negev, but highlighting, of course, interacting with God, places of encounter with God that we see at Shechem, later on the hill that's poised between Bethel and Ai, just northeast of Jerusalem, and then finally into the southern reaches of the land, the classical Negev. Each time he builds an altar, worships the Lord, would offer sacrifices and dedication to God, thanksgiving, celebration, consecration. These sacrifices offered in honor to God, who is leading him into this land of promise. Key words are described, of course, on 203, and simply reiterate one more time as he talks about the fivefold repetition of the word blessing, pointing to the theme of this particular scene. He says there are, this idea of blessing, and of course, universal blessing and salvation is the goal of this ultimately in history. The 5 times this is mentioned, where there are only 5 previous mentions of the word of blessing. But there's also words of blessing and cursing. He talks about the symbolism in the passage, and great 7 movements of symbolism: making great, blessing, being a blessing, but also the aspect of curse, that upon any who would despise, attempt to bring contempt upon Abraham and Sarah, or eventually God's called people, he would bring cursing. And if we're familiar with the curses of later on in Israelite history, the blessings and cursings, like in the book of Deuteronomy, cursing would mean judgment, death, removal from the land, exile. But the initial plan is, of course, God to bless the nations. And so we have that special passage in Genesis chapter 12, in the call of Abraham. God, intent and deliberately, wants to bring blessing upon his special creation, humanity, created in his image, male and female. Abram and Sarah would be the initial couple to bring this new world, this new deliberation, this new exemplary work of God in bringing blessing to his people. He says there's a striking contrast in the bottom of page 203 between Abraham's first migration directed by his father and the pagan family. This one now, which takes place in a solitary response to God's command. Solitary meaning Abram, Sarai, leaving their family, leaving their traditional homeland in Upper Mesopotamia to seek anew the land that God intends to bring that blessing upon this special couple. So again, God's intent to bless. 5 times in Genesis 1 to 11, now 5 times in the first 3 verses of Genesis chapter 12. And we'll look at those locations in just a moment as we look at the text of Genesis 12 in the Hebrew. 3 nuances of blessing he describes in the middle paragraph on page 205. Blessing, the nuances of blessing: 1, prosperity, 13 verse 2, verse 5, potency and fertility, the fulfillment that will be brought forth, God's initial plan for humanity to fill the earth. But it's going to be done through a couple that is barren in the initial part of the story. So part 2 of the blessing, and then finally victory, it's spelled out in chapter 22. Isaac, then God's call upon Abraham's faith to be willing to give up his son. Chapter 22, verse 17. Blessings bring the power for life, the enhancement of life, and the increase of life, as he quotes from Horst's commentary in the German, in the footnote there on the bottom of page 205. So God's desire to bring blessing, to make a great name for Abraham, of course, as he describes, a life of superior character, not simply that everybody's going to speak the name of Abraham, but that he will create in and through the name of Abraham greatness that is a character of a person following faithfully God's call. That is to have a great name. A great name to be found in one who faithfully follows God's call upon his or her life.